Alrighty, so Launch America, which I guess is the branding put around this historic event, was the first time since 2011 that Americans were launched into space from American soil. Those two Americans were, or are, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley. And this occurred on May 30th, 2020. The other reason why this was such a historic launch is that it was the first time ever in history that human beings, astronauts, are being launched on a private commercial spaceship. Well, commercial is probably not the right term to use, but a private spaceship built and engineered by the folks over at SpaceX in collaboration with NASA. And I personally love things that have to do with space and this level of technological innovation. So this type of thing is really intriguing to me. So circling back to Bob and Doug, they were shot off to the International Space Station. So what is the International Space Station? The International Space Station is this big satellite looking thing that is known as a modular space station, which floats around in low Earth orbit approximately 250 miles off of the Earth's surface. So it's somewhere between the Earth and the Moon, specifically 250 miles away from the Earth in low Earth orbit. And just for context, the actual Moon is about 238,000 miles away from the Earth. So the space station is 250 miles away. The Moon is 238,000 miles away. It's a habitable satellite, meaning that people do live in it and have since the year 2000. And it was built in collaboration with several countries and space programs across the world. So you have the United States, Russia, Japan, Europe, and Canada. Which countries specifically in Europe, I'm not sure. But Europe as a whole has the one space program known as ESA. So like the United States, for example, has NASA, Europe has ESA. So the first components of the International Space Station, also known as ISS, were launched in 1998. Over 2 years, different parts were sent to it to continue building it. And then the first astronauts were sent to it on November 2nd, or arrived to it on November 2nd of the year 2000. And since then, human beings have been on board the International Space Station every single day ever since. So that's like 19 plus years and counting. It'll be 20 years this November. Now, the significance of the International Space Station, amongst other things, is that certain research and development and scientific research that cannot be done here on Earth is done on the International Space Station in the fields of astrobiology, astronomy, physics, meteorology, etc. Now, aside from that, scientists also study what actually happens to people that live in space. What happens to our bodies, our tissues, our muscles, our bone density. And not just physically, but the emotional and mental tolls that it takes on the astronauts that go into space. Scientists also study and learn how to keep a spacecraft working for a very long period of time. The International Space Station is expected to continue operation until the year 2030. And these are lessons that are going to become more and more important as time goes on, and deep space exploration expands to places beyond the International Space Station, like going to the moon again and to Mars, etc., which NASA, for example, has plans for. But before we get into that, I just want to circle back to exactly how the aesthetics of this space station. How big is it? And on NASA's website, it's described as, quote, "The space station is as big inside as a house with 5 bedrooms. It has 2 bathrooms, a gymnasium, and a big bay window. 6 people are able to live there at any one given point in time, and it weighs almost 1 million pounds. It is big enough to cover a football field, including the end zones. And it has science labs from the United States, Russia, Japan, and Europe." So it sounds like Canada is slipping a little bit there with the space lab category. All right, so circling back to SpaceX. SpaceX is an aerospace manufacturer of rocket ships. It was founded in 2002 by Elon Musk with the goal of reducing space transportation costs to enable the colonization of Mars, the planet Mars. Now, reducing the cost of space transportation is key. That's really important because, for example, one of the biggest reasons why we haven't been back to the moon since 1969 is cost. Now, the cost is relative to what the actual budget is for NASA, for example, here in the United States. So in relation to an entire yearly budget of United States spending, the NASA budget is less than half of 1%. I believe it's currently 0.48% of the entire budget, which is about $22 billion. The cost that it took us to get to the moon in today's dollars is roughly about 153 billion. So that's almost 7 times the amount. And now that may not seem like a lot when looked at in comparison to the entire United States spending budget of trillions of dollars, but relative to the budget of NASA itself, in and of itself, it's like it requires 7 times the amount of money of a yearly budget in order to make that feasible. So clearly attacking the cost issue, or that cost constraint, if you will, is the approach that a visionary would take. Enter Elon Musk, who has done so successfully. He created a rocket ship that shoots off into space, into low Earth orbit, disconnects, pardon the extremely high-tech, I'm sure, very scientifically accurate terminology that I'm using. The rocket ship shoots up into low Earth orbit, disconnects from itself. Like the piece of it, shoots off and continues. And then the other piece where like the thrust and the rockets and like the bottom piece where that would historically just continue off into space and just become like space junk and like float away. He created one that literally comes back through low Earth orbit back into the Earth's atmosphere, and that piece literally goes back to the launching pad exactly where it launched off from, so that very extremely expensive piece of rocket ship can then be reused for future launches. So this undoubtedly reduces the cost of missions to space. It is the first step in this type of reusable rocket ship technology that is so extremely revolutionary.